President McKinley was shot in the breastbone and abdomen on September 6, 1901, by an anarchist. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became president on September 14, 1901. He lived a privileged life in New York and graduated from Harvard with honors. He transformed himself from a puny boy to a barrel-chested man, as his father told him to. His mom, Mittie, died in 1884, and 11 hours later, his wife, Alice, died. Burdened with grief, he turned to the west. There he shot buffalo and bear. He fought Indians and captured outlaw. He said he owed more than he could express to the west. Roosevelt returned to New York and remarried. He ran for mayor in 1886 but failed. He served as the U.S. Civil Service and the city's police commissioner. He was rewarded with a position as Secretary of Navy because he campaigned energetically for William McKinley. But he wanted one of the governing class jobs. He became a viable young Republican, and party leaders urged him to become running mate for McKinley.
From vice president to president, the 1900 presidential contest began with Republicans nominating McKinley as president and Roosevelt as vice president. However, shortly after the election of McKinley, he was assassinated, and Roosevelt became the youngest man to be president. Although Roosevelt was very young, he had more experience in public affairs than most presidents, and he was convinced civilized and barbarian people faced inevitable conflict. He argued that the U.S. must conquer others to bring law, order, and righteousness. The Panama Canal was an ocean path that could enable ships to travel from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. It cut 8,000 miles between San Francisco and New York City. In the late 1840s, it became an important overland link in the sea routes from the East Coast to California. Two treaties were obstacles in the U.S. acquiring the canal: the Bidlack Treaty and the Clayton-Buller Treaty. The Bidlack Treaty guaranteed Colombians control over Panama, and the Clayton-Buller Treaty, which the U.S. agreed to build and fortify a canal only by mutual consent. One event that helped, however, was the Panamanians revolting against the Colombian rule. Roosevelt aided them and signed a treaty to extend the canal zone from 6 to 10 miles wide. Not everyone applauded the president's actions, as they saw him as rough-riding assault upon another republic over the shattered wreckage of international law. Roosevelt later claimed, "I took the canal zone and let Congress debate about the legitimacy of his actions. And while the debate goes on, the construction of the canal does also."
German and British defiance. Roosevelt's possession of Panama Canal created tension against the U.S. from Latin America. America and Europe were constantly intervening with Latin affairs. The Drago Doctrine prohibited armed intervention by other countries to collect debts. In 1902, German and British warships blockaded Venezuela to force debt payments. This is a complete defiance of both the Drago Doctrine and the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt's Corollary. The Roosevelt's Corollary states that in certain circumstances, the U.S. is justified in intervening in Latin America in order to prevent the European countries from extracting debt from Latin America first. In 1904, Roosevelt sent 2 warships to Venezuela, in practice of Roosevelt's Corollary. After this event, the U.S. would constantly deny Drago Doctrine. Peacemaker Roosevelt and the Treaty of Portsmouth. Russia and Japan had begun a war over Japan's attempts to expand its influence in China and Korea. On February 8th, Japanese warships destroyed Russian warships. After this, Roosevelt sponsored a peace conference between the two nations in Portsmouth. On September 5, 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed. During the conference, Russia acknowledged Japan's predominant political, military, and economic interests in Korea. Both Russia and Korea agreed to leave the disputed area alone, which is Manchuria. Around the same time, Roosevelt sent William Howard Taft to meet with the Japanese foreign minister. They ended up negotiating what is called the Taft-Katsura Agreement, and they signed this on July 29th, 1905. The agreement was the U.S.'s acceptance of Japanese control of Korea in exchange for Japan acknowledging the U.S. control of the Philippines. These treaties and agreements only fed the fire of East Asian racism in America. The Great White Fleet. In 1907, Roosevelt sent the entire U.S. fleet of warships to a 14-month tour around the world to demonstrate America's power and to, quote, show the Pacific is as much our home waters as the Atlantic. The 18 battleships, 8 armored cruisers, and an assortment of support ships of the Great White Fleet received a warm welcome. It was a triumphant and successful tour that ended just in time for the close of Roosevelt's presidency. The Great White Fleet is an example of Roosevelt's success in expanding the U.S. power abroad. However, it would have very different views and effects on different parts of the world. It is described that underneath Roosevelt's imperialistic views, there was a militantly racist view of the world. This developed the idea that there were civilized societies and barbarous ones in the world, and that it was the responsibility of the civilized nations to exercise control of the barbarous people and by any force necessary.
Taft's dollar diplomacy. Taft practiced dollar diplomacy after Roosevelt. He used the State Department to invest in foreign companies. He sent American troops to restore stability in countries that didn't have it. Wilson's interventionism. Wilson attacked the diplomacy. He argued that the state should stabilize the weak governments. He intervened in other countries and tried to justify his intervention. United States and Mexico. The Mexicans revolted against Porfirio Diaz. They also revolted against each other. They were getting so out of hand that the Americans had to start governing Veracruz. Wilson became furious and sent troops, but returned them shortly after to deal with a bigger war happening.